Let's continue with the program. So there's now 3 papers following one each other, themed together, just by me alone, with the kind of ideas that I got from them, under the rubric post-colonial issues, so that there is some link to post-colonial theorization or post-colonial condition there. I'm not saying that the speakers will necessarily theorize about that, but still that's the theme here in this session. So first we have Elina Seye presenting a paper that was or has been co-written with Anna Rastas from Tampere University. Elina herself represents the Global Music Center, is there now developing the research activities within that, and is an expert on dance studies, has been or wrote her PhD on Senegalese dance.
And music.
And music.
And music.
Well, there's very few cases in the world, I guess, where dancing takes place without the devices we call music. Right. But nevertheless. So Elina now is going to talk about music as a site for Africaness and Diaspora cultures. The floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Okay, great. Yes, well, the paper was kind of compiled by myself alone on the basis of this article that we wrote together with Anna, and this is based on our joint project on African musicians in Finland, and it's very, or maybe I am very non-theoretical, so I will not be theorizing much about anything, but Anna has been more discussing more in, for example, some details are discussed more in this article that you can get a copy of from me if you want. And hopefully we will be starting a new project sort of related to this theme in the near future. It's being planned, but as Antti Ville mentioned, my expertise is actually more on the African continent and not in issues of multiculturalism, so this is kind of a new field for me. Anyways, in this paper, the focus is on how Africanness is performed and articulated by African musicians, who we have been talking to on different occasions, me and Anna Rasta separately and together. And especially the aim of the whole project has been to kind of make visible the contributions of African musicians living in Finland to Finnish society and culture. So one could maybe say that multiculturalism has been our ideology in a sense, to kind of to add to the agency of these people and make them more visible in our society, because we both think that there are people who have been doing a lot of important work, but they are not very well known and their work is not known, and as you will soon hear, they have problems of finding work as musicians. And to say just a few words more my computer is doing this. Sorry. Anna has been working a lot with African communities in Finland, and also with these issues of racism. So that is one of the topics that we also discussed with these musicians, but we are not dealing much with that in this particular instance. So all of this relates a lot to Anna's projects on African communities, African diaspora in Finland. And I have been kind of the person bringing the music side to the project. So, to give a little bit of background, especially for those who are not from Finland, on the Finnish situation. So there is a relatively low number of people of African descent living in Finland. And, well, in general, there is a relatively low number of people who are not white Finns living in Finland until today, despite all the recent immigration. So our discussion here concerns mainly immigrant musicians, because there are very few musicians of African descent who would be born in Finland, or who would like to categorize them as people of the African diaspora, and especially because we are limiting, in this case, the discussion to musicians who actually play music considered African. I mean, there are some, I will explain that a little bit later. So, although there is a relatively low number of people of African descent living in Finland, there have been several professional musicians from different African countries living here already since the early 1990s, and their immigration to Finland was a result of collaboration with Finnish musicians or Finnish institutions. And these people have mainly come from Senegal and from Tanzania due to various personal connections or institutional connections. Whereas otherwise from these particular countries there has not been a lot of immigration to Finland, especially until recently maybe. So especially for the case of Senegal, there was in the 1990s, like really the majority of Senegalese living in Finland were actually professional musicians. So it was a kind of a very unusual situation, I suppose. Whereas in other countries, usually the musicians have come from the communities that are there already. So as mentioned, in this case we are excluding musicians, for example, these young rappers who have maybe been born in Finland or who came to Finland very young, there are several of, but now we're concentrating on people who kind of identify themselves as African musicians in several senses. First of all, that they feel that they are Africans. For these younger generation musicians, they do not necessarily identify themselves very strongly with the African diaspora. But many of these musicians that we are talking about, they really consider themselves Africans living in Finland. And secondly, that they play music that would be considered African, either some genre of traditional music or popular music genres that are identified as African genres. Or that have their origins in the African continent. And we have actually organized a few seminars. The first one of which that we organized together was called Being an African Musician in Finland, which was in 2011, and the discussions of that seminar are basically the main source for this paper, but there have been other seminars afterwards. There was a second seminar, I think in 2013, also organized at Fest Africa Festival in Tampere, where I have also been active as an organizer, and hopefully, I don't know if Menard is coming afterwards here. He was listed at least under the names who should be present, so he will be talking about Fest Africa. And so there was a second seminar which was called, I believe, Collaborating with African Musicians, where we invited a few Finnish musicians who have been very active in playing African music and to talk about their collaborations and how do they feel as performers of some sort of African music, or how have they been influenced by these collaborations with Africans. And then there was last year a Nordic seminar which was not that much concentrated on the practices of music, but more on the kind of on institutions of festivals and promotion and that sort of things. And this has been kind of a collaboration with musicians and organizers and us as researchers, or myself kind of in between, both as an organizer and a researcher. But in that particular discussion of 2011 under the topic of being an African musician in Finland, this term African musician was really not called into question by the participants. There were participants from different countries, including Senegal and Tanzania, but also some other countries. I believe at least Mozambique and no, I'm not sure, Gambia, I think. And so this was a term that obviously the participants could identify with, and it seemed that in that situation where you have a group of people from different backgrounds, it was also a kind of a strategic choice to talk of oneself as African and kind of emphasize this community and unity of African musicians in Finland, instead of focusing on the differences between different genres of music or different traditions. And this also happens in the promotion of events or workshops or concerts, that people often use the term African music or African dance or Afro instead of referring to the particular traditions that are actually being heard or seen in those performances or being taught in these workshops and courses. And we really kind of, or myself especially as a researcher of African musics, I really tried to kind of tease out these ideas about differences. So, but maybe in that context where there were so many people present, they were not very eager to talk about differences, for example, between West African and East African music or something like that. The only groups that were kind of seen as different were these larger immigrant communities or refugee communities of Congolese and especially the Somalis, who were seen as somehow very different from other Africans living in Finland. But I think I will return to that question as well later. So in that discussion, these differences were really downplayed or not kind of brought into the discussion, except by myself. So one of the questions was then also of not only of what is an African in the term African musician, but also who is a musician or who is a professional musician. And this was also a topic that was not really that much dealt with, but there were some comments on this question that there are people who kind of, well, they are Africans and they pretend that they are professional musicians. But since in that discussion, I think there were some people present who were kind of maybe not that professional in music, so this also was not very thoroughly discussed, but it was kind of hinted on that there are people who pretend to be professional musicians, whereas they are not. But there were also, but what was brought into the discussion was this demand for diplomas. That okay, the people who have grown up in Africa, in some African countries, many of these countries, there is no formal education for musicians. Some countries do have, but people might be, of course, musicians without attending any schools. And many of them have had some sort of a musical education within the families or their extended families, but they do not have any diplomas to prove that they have studied music. And this kind of traditional forms of education in African music are often very much misunderstood in the Western context. When musicians, for example, they say that, okay, I learned with my family, Finnish people might connect these ideas to these kind of stereotypical ideas of, well, you know, the Africans, they have rhythm in their blood and so on. Whereas what is meant that they come from a specific family of musicians where the music is transmitted from relatives to younger relatives and so on. So this is something that is kind of culture specific, but seems to be a common problem for African musicians in Finland. And this was the question, of course, how can you become popular if you are not accepted? So they referred also to experiences of racism and racism in the, well, just in the sense of racism, but also these questions of that they come from a different background and people do not necessarily accept them as musicians, especially those who are not. Of course, with Finnish colleagues, Finnish musicians, they are usually very happy to work with and do not have problems with that. But when they are, for example, trying to have job opportunities and they are asked for, well, what is your background and what kind of a CV do you have or something like that to promote themselves, they do not have the materials to do that. And what, especially in that article, we concentrated on the sites of African music. So there are certainly some events of African diaspora communities. There are associations that organize events. There are events in churches. But this was not our focus really. But as I already actually noted, that these professional musicians living in Finland actually come from different countries or different areas than the largest groups of immigrants. So this kind of sites for African music are do not necessarily include professional musicians. For example, church ceremonies, and so there are church choirs that the leader might be a professional, but most of the singers are not, and so on. Of course, there are different kinds of concerts, clubs, and festivals. But it seems that there are not enough opportunities to perform, and especially the people who had come to Finland already in the early 90s, they said that, well, at that time, before the 90s recession, there was a huge interest in African music or different musics of the world, and they could get like fixed contracts that they would play every weekend at clubs. And there were lots of job opportunities, and that was actually why they came to Finland, that they saw that there were opportunities to work as a musician. But then with the recession, all of this kind of vanished, and it has not really recovered since this kind of club opportunities at clubs to perform, so that they could have kind of regular contacts and contracts and regular income from performing music. And although nowadays the audiences are much more familiar with African musics, there are less opportunities to perform, and there is also more competition because there are now lots more musicians from Africa, but also Finns who have learned African music, who are able to perform in more or less the same level as musicians born in the African continent. So of course then musicians have tried to find other sources of income, and there are many who have been teaching music and dance, which is of course an obvious choice for musicians, many of whom also are familiar with the local dance traditions. And for some of this has been a way to survive, as one of our the people at this seminar stated that, well, for so many years we survived on teaching dance. So for some this has not been really kind of their choice, but something that they had to do to survive. But there are many also who find teaching very gratifying. They feel that there they have this kind of direct contact to Finnish people, and there they also have an opportunity to make their cultures better known to Finnish people whereas when they play at clubs or at concerts or festivals, this contact is more limited, and they do not have that many opportunities to really talk about culture and like make it known. And then many have found work in different kinds of projects promoting multiculturalism, which connects to the previous presentation. So this has been often in the forms of music workshops, school concerts, or any kinds of project at schools and daycare centers, where people usually kind of combine performances or workshops with the possibility of telling about their native countries and their cultures. And there were several musicians who talked about these situations, for example, at schools or in daycare centers, where they really feel that they have had the opportunity to influence Finnish people's views of Africa and Africans, and they feel that working with children is a good opportunity to do that, because children are kind of open and curious, and they do not have these fixed ideas about different cultures yet. Although they may be misconceptions, and they say that often they have to answer these very strange questions, and they feel positive about it because children are open to their answers. And of course there are many musicians who also organize events themselves to create more job opportunities. I noticed that I have actually planned a little bit too much to say. So I'll try to skip some of the things. So as I mentioned, there is the problem of finding sufficient income through music, and many musicians actually nowadays work in other fields in addition to playing music or instead of playing music. There are several of the kind of older generation musicians who nowadays they are taxi drivers and bus drivers and so on, and they rarely actually perform. And then there is this role of a cultural ambassador, which is especially visible in these projects. But this is also a kind of a role that some are really interested in, but others would others would prefer just playing music and being musicians, and they just have to, because they are living in Finland, they have to take on this role of the cultural ambassador, and they do it, although they might not want to do that at all times. And in this role they often face these stereotypical images of African music, and although they often do have opportunities to challenge these images, and they see that it is important to challenge them, what we observed was also that the same musicians that we're talking about, that they are really fed up with all these stereotypical ideas and racism and so on. They also in some instances we saw that the same people would use these same stereotypical images, for example, the black man with the djembe, or other such images of very colorful costumes, for example, and they would use it as a strategy for promotion. And there are several musicians who actually play other instruments professionally, but they have been teaching African percussions because they are Africans and they are musicians, so I suppose they can do it. Or some of them probably do it very well, but it just seems sometimes a little bit strange that a bass player would be teaching djembe, or that, for example, East Africans would be teaching djembe drumming, which also happens. But ultimately, there were different views and definitions of Africa and Africanness, and although musicians themselves would use these stereotypical images of Africa on stage in their costumes or as a strategy to find work, there were very little these kinds of essentialist views of Africanness in relation to African music, so that usually professional musicians who were kind of confident of their professionalism would rarely state something like, well, you cannot learn this if you're white or something like that. Whereas some musicians who were maybe not in the same level, they would more easily claim to the ideas that, well, you can never learn this because you're not African. But actually most of the musicians that we interviewed, they would say that, well, that they have Finnish colleagues who can play just as well as some African musicians. And they would be glad to perform together also with white Finnish people, even when playing African music, and not necessarily some sort of a fusion. But the definitions of Africa and Africanness would, of course, be a little bit different depending on the personal histories of the musicians. And often the word African, or what I have seen actually in other situations, African musicians often use the word African to refer to their own home countries. Because, of course, African countries as well, most of them are very multi-ethnic, so this African is used as a definition or as a term for all the different ethnicities that are present there. I think I'm running out of time, but maybe to continue a little bit on that. So the African is often used as kind of an umbrella concept in the Finnish context in many senses. First of all, there are events organized by African musicians or non-Africans, depends. Often they include performances of different African styles of music, and often also including styles of the from the African diasporas, meaning, for example, Afro-Cuban music. And there are many practical reasons for this. There are limited resources, but there is also the need to reach the widest possible audience because the audience base is not very large here in Finland, as mentioned. And of course, it's quite natural to African musicians living in Europe to be influenced by different types of African styles and also European styles or Afro-American styles, and to collaborate with other musicians of different backgrounds. And as mentioned, unity rather than difference of African cultures was emphasized by musicians. And there were, for example, in Fest Africa 2013, there were 2 projects that kind of reflect this kind of new African diasporic cultures, or whatever you might want to name them. There was the tour Acoustic Africa 3 Afropean Women, which was a joint tour of 3 African ladies who come from the Ivory Coast and from Cameroon originally, but they did this tour together with a kind of multicultural African band. And then there was a more local project, The Rise of the Queens, which combined Tanzanian and Afro-Brazilian traditions, and it was a very mixed cast of mainly Finnish performers, but also some Brazilians and Tanzanians, and I don't know if there were anything else. So, to come to some kind of conclusions, there is a multiplicity of sites where African music is performed in Finland, and there is a range of roles attributed to and assumed by African musicians. And this kind of relates to the need to redefine one's identity in the new living and working environment here in Finland. And music, all these different sites and different roles that people take or are assigned with, it points to, in our opinion, to music as a kind of an important site where Africanness is performed and negotiated in Finland. And it also, all this music is also a site for possible new cultures to emerge through these musical and other collaborations. I suppose I can end there and you can ask some questions.
Okay, thank you. So we have, let's say, 5 minutes for discussion now. Any comments, questions? Yes, Elina?
It's very nice that Elina's papers followed Professor Solomon's. I think this would be like the next step that you asked how would the next step look. Maybe some avant-garde really things are happening there also. If Solomon's presentation was more about the official idea of multiculturalism, you have spoken of the what's happening on the ground level, which is very different. But yeah, I wanted to ask. You said you asked the question about racism, but you didn't speak about it here. Could you
No,
say
we
something?
didn't really. We didn't much ask about it, but it's something that just comes in the discussions that they are. Well, of course, they are confronted with that. That of course, when they play somewhere, there might be people coming in who don't know what's going on, or just in everyday lives. And they also, I'm not sure if it's part of the experience of racism that they feel that they are not appreciated as musicians. It might be partly a misconception. There might be, I see that there are also a lot of expectations that are just not realistic in terms of people just don't know what to expect as a musician working in Finland. That they expect that they would be paid like 10 times more than what people are usually paid. But it's true also that in some situations they are asked to perform for free, just while you have an opportunity to present your culture and so on. But I think these kinds of things are familiar to other musicians as well, that while you can come here and promote your new album and play for free. So I think this is something that is not necessarily connected to racism, but it is sometimes experienced as racist, that they feel that they are not appreciated as musicians. But that was actually a topic. I think Anna also has been dealing so much with questions of racism that in this project we did not really want to go very deeply into that. Yeah, my comment actually to the previous paper was that although I do agree with all that you said but I think it's wonderful that they have this project, because that makes certain people they make them at least visible, because I think in Finland the problem is that these people, they are so invisible, and their contribution to that they are actually quite competent in music and that kind of things, they are just not recognized at all. So I think it's still a kind of a gesture to recognize that, okay, these people are there. And I see it as a kind of a social project as well. Because one of the things actually that we discussed also in this, or there was a long discussion on the question of schools, that why do schools, they might have like in their school books like one song from Africa, and then they might have sometimes some sort of project. So I think it's still kind of a wonderful idea to bring all these kids together, and I don't know, in a very grassroots sort of thinking here. But I understand that there are these bigger problems, and I don't know how well. Our idea has been to kind of come to the question of multiculturalism as an ideology, to make these people more visible through research. And also this has contributed that there was an exhibition that just ended a few weeks ago in Tampere, where was the same idea, to make these African communities in Finland visible and show what their contribution to Finnish culture has been. So all of that has resulted from all of these discussions. So in a sense, but of course I think the problem is in any case, when you bring these things to a stage, there are certain expectations, or you bring them to a museum as we did in that project. There are many people who participated there. there's also there's a certain kind of structure that is expected in any case of the performers or of the how it's put how an exhibition is presented, for example. So I think there is always the question of where is the how can a culture that comes a different kind of a culture, how is it represented in a different context? If there
I'm
is
sorry,
still
I think we really have to move on now.
Okay.
So I'm running some 10 minutes late, and then well, this just has to do with the fact that well, the lunch places around here, several of them close at 1 o'clock, so we want to catch those. So